Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into the surprisingly well-documented, yet often misunderstood, daily life of Roman prostitutes. So, before you settle in too comfortably, please take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content I create. And drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe. Now, let's dim the lights a bit, maybe turn on a fan to get that soft background noise going. And let's ease into our journey together this evening. Imagine waking up, or to be more accurate, regaining consciousness, in a space that's so cramped you can barely turn around without knocking your elbow against the wall. Congratulations! You're living in a cellar, the ancient Roman version of a work-from-home setup. If that home were a broom closet and your job required liberal application of body oil. These rooms were pretty standard for many of Rome's working women, typically located in brothels, lupanars, or stacked above taverns and bathhouses. These were tiny, windowless chambers that served as both living quarters and workspaces. Think of it as a studio apartment designed by someone who really, really hates light, fresh air, and any semblance of privacy. Your mattress is stuffed with straw, probably shared with a few fleas, and smells faintly of wine, smoke, and, well, disappointment. If you're fortunate, there's a small oil lamp. If you're really fortunate, it hasn't been stolen yet. Your few possessions: some cheap makeup, a comb, and maybe a bronze mirror if times are good, are shoved into a corner like they're just as tired of being there as you are. There's no running water. There's no plumbing. There's just a bucket that you try your best not to think about. Bathing? Upon registration, you were entered into an official list of sex workers. Think of it as joining a trade union, except there were no benefits, and instead of a card, you got a branding, literally. Yes, some sex workers, especially enslaved ones, were branded or tattooed with marks like lupa or their owner's name. If you're wondering how that made clients feel, don't worry. The branding wasn't for them. It was to ensure you couldn't pretend to be respectable later. And the tax rate? It varied depending on location, class, and whether your clients were sad senators or discount gladiators. But it always stung. You paid per act or per week, depending on the region. And there was no deduction for emotional labor, uncomfortable silences, or existential dread. Refusing to pay could result in fines, arrest, or being barred from working. Though enforcement was spotty, especially if you were paying under the table or knew how to flirt with an edile, still, for a profession already swimming in stigma, this tax added insult to injury. Rome was essentially saying, "We disapprove of your lifestyle. Also, give us 10%. But hey, on the bright side, at least you could proudly say your labor was helping to fund another temple, probably dedicated to a goddess who still wouldn't return your prayers." In Rome, being a prostitute meant you had legal permission to exist and social permission to be endlessly judged. Yes, prostitution was tolerated by the law, taxed, regulated, even registered. But that didn't stop every senator, priest, and bored philosopher from telling you how much they disapproved of you, often while zipping up their tunic. Enter the moral police, not an official squad with batons, but a vast, unpaid network of senators, priests, matrons, and writers who all believed it was their divine duty to shame you while enjoying the fruits of your labor behind closed doors. Healers in Viking society had a deep understanding of their environment. They knew which plants grew in which seasons, how to harvest them properly, and how to preserve them for use during the long, dark winters. Knowledge was passed down through generations, often from mother to daughter, or from elder to apprentice. These traditions blended elements of Germanic herbal law with the rich cosmology of Norse mythology. In a world without hospitals or modern antibiotics, the skill of the healer and the power of plants like yarrow were essential to survival and to maintaining strength in a warrior-driven culture. While yarrow addressed bleeding and surface wounds, the Viking healers' battle against infection required stronger remedies. One of the most revered herbs in this regard was angelica, or Angelica archangelica, a tall, aromatic plant with hollow stalks and umbelled clusters of greenish-white flowers. It thrived in the cold climates of Scandinavia, and it was considered so valuable that it was cultivated in monastery gardens long after the Viking Age ended. Angelica held a central place in early northern European medicine, prized for its broad-spectrum medicinal properties. Viking healers used the root, leaves, and seeds to prepare a variety of treatments. Most commonly, the root was dried and then steeped into decoctions to fight internal infections. It was known for its warming effect on the body, and it was used to stimulate circulation, cleanse the blood, and reduce inflammation. The antiseptic properties of angelica were vital in treating infected wounds, especially those that had been neglected or exposed to dirt and decay. A healer might grind the root and mix it with animal fat or beeswax to create a salve, then apply it to festering injuries. When ingested as a tea or tincture, angelica helped combat respiratory infections, fevers, and digestive issues, ailments that could become life-threatening in a time without antibiotics. Beyond its medicinal uses, nettle also served practical roles in Viking society. Its strong fibers were used to make rope, fishing nets, and even cloth, particularly during times when flax or wool were scarce. This dual utility, nourishing the body and supporting daily life, made nettle a deeply integrated and valued part of Viking culture. Symbolically, nettle was seen as a plant of resilience. It thrived even in disturbed soil and returned year after year, regardless of how often it was cut back. In Norse society, where survival required both strength and adaptability, nettle embodied those essential values. For the healer, it served as a reminder that even the most seemingly harmful plants could offer healing, and that true power often came from sources that initially seemed dangerous. Viking herbal medicine was never formally written down in texts during the Viking Age itself. Instead, it existed as an oral tradition, passed down through spoken words, in chants shared from mother to daughter, in gestures exchanged among wise women, and in the quiet, observant work of healers who blended tradition, careful observation, and deeply held beliefs. These practices formed a rich body of knowledge that was deeply rooted in both the natural environment and Norse cosmology. To treat illness in the Viking world was not just about curing the physical body. It was also about restoring balance to the individual, the household, and the invisible connections that linked them to the gods. Healers in Viking society worked with the resources that the land provided. They possessed intimate knowledge of which herbs to gather in the spring, which roots to dry in the autumn, and how to preserve medicinal plants throughout the long and harsh winter months. Yarrow, angelica, birch, juniper, meadowsweet, mugwort, garlic, and nettle each played a specific role, but all were integral parts of a larger system of understanding the body in harmony with nature. Joan arrived outside the fortified city of Paris in early September of 1429 and immediately began preparations for battle. Paris was extremely well defended, boasting strong walls, formidable fortifications, and experienced English and Burgundian forces stationed inside. On September 8th, she led an assault on the Porte Saint-Honoré, one of the city's main gates. As always, she carried her sacred banner and fought bravely at the front lines, encouraging the troops with impassioned prayers and unwavering determination. The fighting was fierce and intense. The defenders poured down a relentless barrage of arrows, stones, and boiling oil upon the attacking French forces. Joan herself was struck by a crossbow bolt in the thigh, but she steadfastly refused to abandon the field. She continued to direct the battle from behind the lines, calling for another charge and urging her men to press forward. However, despite her valiant efforts and the bravery of the French troops, the attack stalled. With nightfall rapidly approaching and casualties mounting steadily, Charles's commanders ordered a retreat, much to Joan's vehement protest. The failed attack on Paris marked a significant turning point in Joan's fortunes. Her reputation remained largely intact among the common soldiers and the general populace, but within the royal court, doubts about her abilities and her influence began to grow. Charles, now securely on the throne as king, no longer relied on her advice and guidance as he once had. Political considerations, a growing fear of provoking further conflict, and a deep-seated distrust of Joan's seemingly boundless spiritual authority began to overshadow her earlier triumphs. Yet, Joan remained undeterred. She continued to lead smaller military campaigns in the following months, capturing towns such as Saint-Pierre-le-Moudier and La Chérite-sur-Loire, often financing these operations herself with donations from her devoted supporters. By the spring of 1429, the city of Orleans had been under siege by the English for several months. Its fall would have opened the path to the heart of France, likely leading to the collapse of French resistance. Morale was at rock bottom, supplies were dwindling, and the Dauphin's cause was teetering on the brink of defeat. Then Joan of Arc arrived. She entered the city on April 29th, greeted by cheering crowds who believed her to be a miracle sent by God. Clad in white armor and riding a white horse, she quickly became a symbol of hope and divine favor. Her presence reinvigorated the French troops and the citizens of Orleans. Although she had no formal military training, Joan spoke with boldness and authority, urging immediate action against the English fortifications. French commanders, initially hesitant to take orders from a teenage peasant girl, soon found themselves drawn to her conviction. Joan advocated for an aggressive strategy, claiming that her voices had promised victory. Despite her youth, she rode into battle alongside the soldiers, often placing herself in the most dangerous positions. Her courage on the battlefield inspired others to fight with renewed determination. Over the course of a week, the French launched a series of offensives to break the siege. Joan wielded not only her sword, but also her banner, rallying the troops with cries of faith and purpose. She was wounded during the assault on the fortress of Les Tourelles, struck in the shoulder by an arrow. Refusing to retreat, she returned to the field after having the wound dressed, continuing to encourage the men to press forward. On May 8th, the English finally lifted the siege and withdrew. It was a stunning victory, one that dramatically shifted the momentum of the war. For the first time in years, the French had dealt a decisive blow to the English forces. Joan's role was undeniable. Her leadership, her fearlessness, and her spiritual authority had turned the tide. To truly master the daily grind of medieval baking, a baker needed more than just flour and fire. They depended on a trusted array of tools, each meticulously shaped by generations of skilled craftsmanship. The bakehouse itself was often a simple structure, built of stone or timber frames, but within its walls lay a specialized world. Each item served a specific purpose, and efficiency could mean the difference between profitability and financial ruin. The heart of any bakery was undoubtedly the oven. Typically constructed of clay or brick, these ovens were dome-shaped and massive, designed to retain heat for extended periods. Heating the oven was not a quick process. Bundles of wood, often oak or beech, were burned inside until the walls radiated the ideal temperature. Once heated, the ashes were raked out, and the bread was loaded using a peel, a long-handled wooden paddle that allowed bakers to carefully slide the loaves deep into the scorching chamber without burning themselves. The kneading trough was another essential piece of equipment, usually carved from a single block of wood or built from heavy planks. These troughs were wide and shallow, allowing bakers to efficiently lean into their work. The dough was mixed and worked entirely by hand, and larger bakeries sometimes had several troughs in use simultaneously to keep up with demand. Measuring tools were primitive yet vital. Most bakers relied on wooden scoops or hand-carved measures for flour and salt, though consistency often varied. Scales were rare, and accuracy was often enforced by local guilds or town officials. Cheating customers by underweighting loaves could result in hefty fines or even more severe punishments. Flour was stored in cloth sacks or wooden barrels, while water was hauled in buckets from wells or streams. Some bakeries also had sieves for removing husks or debris, particularly in more prosperous towns where wealthier customers expected finer bread. That'll be a group activity later on at the nearest public bathhouse, where the water is communal and the awkward eye contact is absolutely free. But there's no time to lounge around because your room is also your office, and business hours are whenever someone knocks, barges in, or just yells through the door. Yes, privacy is definitely a modern concept. Here in Rome, walls are basically just suggestions, and doors? They're mostly decorative. Most days start with a quick cleanup of the room. Sweep out yesterday's dust, wine stains, and any stray sandals left behind by last night's visitors. Then comes the prep work. Face powder, rouge, and enough perfume to pretty much qualify as flammable. You're not necessarily trying to smell good. You're just trying to smell better than the guy waiting in line behind you. You practice your best sultry half-smile in that bronze mirror. Not because it actually works, but because pretending to helps a little. A customer once described you as charmingly awake, and you're still riding the emotional high from that compliment. Because down here in the cellar, every day begins the same way. Cramped, rushed, and filled with just enough dignity to make it to lunchtime. After waking up in your glorified broom closet, it's time to get ready for another day of trying to impress clients and just generally surviving the public judgment. But first, let's talk hygiene, or what passed for it in ancient Rome. There is, of course, no private bathroom. That kind of luxury is reserved solely for the wealthy, and even they just had glorified chamber pots. As a working girl in a city that worships marble statues but seems perfectly okay with open sewers, your best bet is the nearest public fountain or bathhouse, depending on your mood and your tolerance for awkward nudity. If you're pressed for time, and let's be real, you go for the quick rinse at the communal fountain. At the top of the hypocrisy food chain was the Roman Senate, a group of aging elites who believed in preserving Roman virtue, a concept they typically defined as whatever we're not caught doing. Many of them publicly railed against moral decay while maintaining discreet tabs at every brothel from the Forum to suburbia. Then you had the aediles, Rome's actual public officials, who enforced laws on cleanliness, order, and decency. Their job was to regulate brothels, inspect establishments, and sometimes fine women for being too obvious about their profession, which, again, was legally required to be obvious. You couldn't make it subtle if you tried. Writers like Juvenal and Seneca had a field day. They mocked prostitutes in verse, lumping them in with greedy merchants, loud women, and, horror of horrors, women who read books. And yet, these same writers gave vivid, suspiciously detailed descriptions of brothel life, almost as if they'd done extensive research. Even Roman matrons, the respectable wives of the elite, got in on the judgment. They wouldn't speak to you, of course, but they'd walk past your street corner with a gaze that could sterilize a fig tree. Some even petitioned for laws banning prostitutes from wearing jewelry or entering public baths, which is rich considering many of their husbands treated bathhouse visits like part-time jobs. Working as a Roman prostitute came with certain occupational hazards, namely disease, injury, and whatever that thing was that sailor from Brundisium left behind. Welcome to the health and wellness chapter, where the only prescription is hope you survive. Let's begin with the big one, venereal disease. Ancient Rome didn't have germ theory, but they did know that some men left you with more than a coin purse and a bad poem. There are Roman texts that describe symptoms ranging from persistent itching to things falling off that shouldn't. But Angelica's power extended beyond physical healing. In Norse cosmology, certain plants were believed to carry divine energy. The name Angelica itself, though Latin in origin, hints at the spiritual reverence surrounding the plant. In Christianized Europe, it was said to have been revealed by an angel to cure the plague. While Viking belief systems were different, they too held that some plants were gifts from the gods. It's likely that Angelica, with its strong scent and dramatic appearance, was associated with protection and sacred power. Women, who often served as herbalists within the household, used Angelica to treat gynecological conditions. It was thought to regulate menstrual cycles and ease childbirth, a dangerous and sacred moment in Norse society. Because of its reputation as a purifier, Angelica was also used in smoke rituals to cleanse homes and ward off disease during times of illness. In every Viking community, from remote farms to coastal trading towns, Angelica was a cornerstone of natural medicine. Its effectiveness and symbolic weight made it a trusted ally in the healer's quest to preserve life in a harsh and unpredictable world. As spring arrived in the Viking world, it brought with it one of the most vital remedies for fever and fatigue, birch sap. The birch tree, widespread across Scandinavia, was more than just a source of wood. It was a living pharmacy. Vikings tapped the tree in early spring, collecting the clear, slightly sweet sap as it rose from the roots to nourish new leaves. This seasonal practice required skill and timing, as the sap could only be harvested for a short period before the tree fully awakened. Healers used birch sap as a tonic for those weakened by long winters, illness, or lingering fevers. It was served fresh or fermented into a lightly alcoholic drink known for its revitalizing qualities. Treatments were physical, yes, but they also carried symbolic weight. Illness might be viewed as a disturbance in fate, a challenge sent by the gods, or an imbalance between the seen and unseen worlds. women played a central role in preserving and passing down this vital knowledge. Within the longhouses and farmsteads, female healers oversaw the care of families and communities. Some women took on more specialized roles, such as the volar, seers who combined healing practices with prophecy, and who were often called upon during times of crisis. Their work frequently involved the use of sacred herbs, spiritual rituals, and appeals to divine forces such as Frigg, Air, or Freya. Healing was not simply a duty. It was an act of connection between mortal life and the mythic world. With the spread of Christianity and the decline of Norse paganism, much of this rich oral tradition gradually faded or was absorbed into new religious frameworks. Monasteries adopted and preserved some of the herbs and healing techniques, while other practices disappeared altogether or became entangled with superstition and fear. However, echoes of Viking herbal medicine can still be found today in Scandinavian folk healing practices, in modern herbalism, and in a renewed interest in ancestral plant knowledge. The legacy of Viking healers lives on not just in the herbs they used, but in the worldview they preserved, the understanding that nature holds immense power, that healing is both a physical and a spiritual process, and that true wisdom often resides in those who listen attentively to the land. Joan of Arc was born in the winter of 1412 in the rural village of Domremy, a quiet hamlet in northeastern France, nestled near the border of Burgundy. At the time, France was deeply fractured by war and civil unrest. The 100 Years' War between England and France had already dragged on for decades, and northern France was caught directly in the crossfire. However, the tide was clearly shifting against her. Her unwavering vision of total victory clashed sharply with the king's increasingly cautious and politically motivated stance. Despite her persistent injuries, her dwindling support within the royal court, and her growing political isolation, Joan remained steadfastly convinced that her mission was not yet complete. She vowed not to stop fighting until France was completely free from English domination. But in the shadows, betrayal, conspiracy, and grave danger were steadily closing in around her. In the spring of 1430, Joan of Arc continued her military campaign, even though her position had become increasingly precarious. Although her remarkable successes on the battlefield had brought her widespread fame and popular support, they had not translated into lasting political power or influence. King Charles VII, now focused more on diplomatic negotiations than on aggressive warfare, offered her only lukewarm support at best. Joan, acting largely on her own initiative and with limited resources, turned her attention to the strategically important town of Compiègne, which was then under threat from Burgundian forces. She arrived in Compiègne in May of 1430, hoping to defend the town and rally the local population to resist the Burgundian siege. However, the odds were heavily stacked against her. The Burgundians, who were staunch allies of the English, were closing in on the town with significantly superior numbers. On May 23rd, Joan led a small force in a daring sally, or sudden attack, to challenge the besiegers and disrupt their lines. As the battle unfolded just outside the city walls, the French forces were gradually pushed back towards the town. Joan bravely remained behind to cover the retreat, determined to protect her soldiers and prevent a complete rout. In the ensuing chaos and confusion, the city gates were closed prematurely, trapping Joan and a small group of her companions outside. The victory at Orleans was more than just a military achievement. It was a turning point in the national consciousness of France. The peasant girl from Domremy had fulfilled the first part of her divine mission. Now she turned her focus towards her second goal, to see the Dauphin crowned as king at Reims, the traditional site of French coronations. The road to legitimacy had begun. With the siege of Orleans lifted, Joan of Arc's mission shifted toward a far more symbolic objective, the coronation of Charles the Dauphin. In her visions, this was not merely a political event. It was a divine command. Charles needed to be crowned at Reims, the traditional site where French kings were anointed with sacred oil. However, Reims was located deep within territory controlled by the Burgundians, allies of the English. To reach it, Joan and the French army would have to march through hostile lands. Despite the risk, Joan was adamant. Her belief that God had cleared the path gave her confidence, and her conviction began to influence even the cautious Charles. After a series of victories along the Loire Valley, including battles at Jargeau, Mung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency, momentum was on their side. The army gained strength as towns submitted and morale soared. By July 1429, Joan and the royal court set out on what would later be called the coronation journey. Along the way, cities and castles opened their gates without resistance. Word of Joan's miraculous success had spread. Many believed that to resist her was to resist divine will. Her presence in the army, young, determined, and riding under her white banner, created an aura of invincibility. On July 16th, the French forces reached Reims. The city's leaders, after some hesitation, surrendered peacefully. The next day, inside the Cathedral of Reims, Charles was crowned King Charles VII of France. Joan stood beside him, holding her banner high. For her, it was the fulfillment of the prophecy she had received from her voices. However, coarser flowers were generally common for the lower classes. Perhaps the most valuable tool of all was the baker's own hands, calloused, experienced, and honed by years of tireless repetition. They knew instinctively when the dough was ready, when the oven was hot enough, and when a loaf was just beginning to sing its final crusty notes. Everything had to be thoroughly cleaned and prepared before the next day began. The tools, humble though they may have seemed, were an integral part of a larger rhythm, a cycle of labor, skill, and heat that transformed raw grain into life-sustaining bread. In the capable hands of a medieval baker, each tool played a vital role in feeding a town. In the medieval world, bread was far more than just food. It served as the foundation of every meal and acted as a clear marker of social class. Almost everyone consumed it daily, but not all bread was created equal. What you ate spoke volumes about who you were. The wealthiest citizens, including nobles, clergy, and prosperous merchants, demanded the finest bread, known as manchet or white bread, made from finely sifted wheat flour. This bread was remarkably soft, pale in color, and expensive to produce. Its production required significant extra labor, including grinding, sifting out bran, and using only the most refined portions of the grain. This labor-intensive process significantly raised its cost, placing it well beyond the reach of commoners. For townsfolk and tradesmen, revel or wheaten bread was the standard. Still crafted from wheat, it was less refined, slightly darker in color, and more nutritious. It struck a balance between cost and quality, and bakers sold it in greater quantities than manchet. In some towns, regulations dictated that this type of bread must be sold at a fixed weight and price, preventing bakers from exploiting those who were hungry. Splash some water on your face, rinse out your mouth with wine if you're feeling fancy, and just hope that the fountain hasn't been used to clean a chicken that morning. There's no soap, but maybe you've got a bit of natron, a salty cleaning powder that exfoliates both your skin and your self-esteem. If business is slow and you've got some coins jingling around in your little purse, you might splurge on a visit to the public baths. The great Roman equalizer. Everyone's there. Merchants, soldiers, philosophers, and that one guy who always talks way too loudly about his hemorrhoids. You get undressed, store your belongings in a niche that you probably trust a little too easily, and wade into tepid water that's full of floating philosophical debates and someone else's toenail. Inside, you sweat in the steam room, scrape yourself with a strigil, a curved metal blade, and enjoy a brief moment of feeling like the cleanest person on your street, a title that lasts for approximately 5 minutes. After the bath, you dry off, apply even more perfume, and try to remember if anyone's invented deodorant yet. They haven't. To finish the look, you apply a bit of chalk-based face powder, a touch of rouge for your cheeks and lips, and some kohl around your eyes. Not necessarily to highlight your beauty, but more to hide the fatigue. Clients don't really want to see the woman who's already dealt with 3 senators and a sailor before noon. They want mystery, allure, and someone who doesn't smell like old lentils. Now that you're washed, or at least convincingly perfumed, it's time to get dressed. And while Roman society had a lot of complicated opinions about fashion, there was one outfit in particular that made things crystal clear. The female toga. Yes, the toga. That flowing white garment we usually associate with senators, emperors, and frat parties. But here's the twist. In Rome, a woman wearing a toga wasn't making a political statement. The medical advice was usually a mix of vinegar washes, herbal ointments, and desperate prayers to Venus. Pregnancy was another ever-present concern. There was no birth control pill, but there were options if you had the guts and the budget. Prostitutes used natural contraceptives like silphium, an extinct plant famously overharvested for this exact reason, animal intestines as crude condoms, and tampons soaked in herbal concoctions. Effectiveness? Somewhere between maybe and miracle. If pregnancy occurred, things got complicated. Some women carried to term and raised their children, often within the brothel itself. Others gave infants up to foundling homes, or worse, the open streets. Infanticide wasn't legal, but turning a blind eye, that was practically a civic duty. For day-to-day ailments, sore muscles, cuts, stress-induced rage blackouts, the go-to remedy was usually wine, opium, or a slap from your Lena to stop whining. If that failed, you might visit a temple of Asclepius and sleep on the floor, hoping for a healing dream. Ancient wellness culture was less spa weekend and more mystical nap with potential side effects. Infections were common. Hygiene was ambitious. There were no gloves, no antiseptics, and absolutely no one washing their hands before sticking fingers where fingers had no business being. And let's not forget the emotional toll. Depression, trauma, anxiety, all part of the job. Rome didn't have therapists. You had fellow prostitutes, wine, and the occasional stray cat who listened without judgment. In a city where divine intervention was blamed for everything from floods to flatulence, prostitutes weren't just dodging moral judgment. They were also trying to stay on the gods' good side, or at least bribe them for health, luck, and a low-maintenance clientele. Religion in Rome was a full-time job, and the gods were always watching, judging, and occasionally cursing. Rich in minerals, electrolytes, and natural sugars, birch sap helped rehydrate the body and restore lost energy, especially after the depletion caused by sickness or extended fasting. In an era without formal nutrition science, Viking healers recognized the restorative power of this gift from nature. In cases of fever, healers often paired birch sap with infusions of cooling herbs such as meadowsweet or elderflower. This gentle combination helped bring down body temperature while nourishing the patient. In more serious cases, the sap might be mixed with bitter herbs like wormwood to purge the body of what were believed to be harmful humors. The logic was simple: cleanse, restore, and rebalance. Beyond its internal uses, the birch tree also had a role in external treatments. The bark, when boiled, produced a tar-like substance with antiseptic properties. It was used to treat skin infections, minor burns, and bites. Birch leaves were also used in poultices and steam baths to draw out toxins from the body, often accompanied by prayer or ritual to align the physical with the spiritual. Symbolically, the birch tree represented renewal and purity. It was often the first tree to grow after land was cleared or burned, and this regenerative quality made it sacred in both Germanic and Norse traditions. The use of its sap in healing reflected this belief, returning vitality to the sick and offering the promise of recovery after hardship. In the healer's practice, birch sap was a seasonal treasure, a clear, life-giving elixir that marked the changing of the year and the persistence of health in a cold and often merciless land. In Viking herbal medicine, juniper was revered for its powerful cleansing properties, both physical and spiritual. Growing abundantly in the rocky soils of Scandinavia, juniper bushes, with their prickly needles and aromatic berries, were among the most trusted tools in a healer's repertoire. Joan was born into this atmosphere of turbulence and uncertainty. She was the daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romee, devout peasants who raised their children in the Roman Catholic faith. Her family lived a modest life. They owned a small patch of land, a few farm animals, and relied primarily on farming to make a living and survive. Joan was not taught to read or write, as was common for most girls of her social class, but she was known from an early age for her diligent work ethic and her deep religious devotion. She spent much of her childhood helping around the house, tending to the sheep, and attending church services. Her world was simple, humble, and deeply rooted in faith. The voices that she would later claim to hear would come to someone who already spent countless hours in prayer and contemplation. Domremy itself was located in a contested area. Although technically loyal to the French crown, it bordered Burgundian territory, a faction that was allied with the English. The constant threat of violence loomed large. Raids by Anglo-Burgundian forces occasionally swept through the region, destroying crops and burning homes. Joan would have grown up hearing stories of heroism and defeat, of saints and warriors, of kings and traitors. Her early years were profoundly shaped by instability, fear, and a deep longing for peace. Despite the pervasive fear that hung over France, Joan's childhood was not entirely devoid of community and connection. She was well liked in the village and was described by her neighbors as kind, pious, and unusually serious for her young age. She often prayed at a nearby chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary, where she would later claim her divine mission began. These formative years laid the spiritual and emotional foundation for what was to come. Her unwavering faith, her fierce loyalty to the French king, and her profound sense of purpose were not cultivated in a royal court, but in the fields and chapels of her small village. Surrounded by Burgundian cavalry, she fought valiantly until she was finally pulled from her horse and taken captive. Her capture was a devastating blow, not only for Joan herself, but also for the morale of the French people. The young woman who had once lifted the siege of Orleans and crowned a king now found herself a prisoner of war, held captive by her enemies. The Burgundians held Joan for several months, treating her more as a valuable political prize than as a common captive. She was eventually sold to the English, for malevolent forces were thought to be all around. Healers or family members would often hang braided garlic near doorways or in sleeping areas. This wasn't just to ward off disease, but also to protect against unseen dangers, particularly during times of illness, war, or childbirth. For Viking warriors, garlic served as both a physical remedy and a spiritual safeguard. It wasn't merely a cure, it was a daily form of defense. Before embarking on raids or long journeys, some Vikings are believed to have consumed garlic as part of their preparation, viewing its strength and fiery essence as a shield within their bodies. In this way, garlic became a symbol of endurance, combating infection, energizing the weak, and grounding the body in a dangerous and constantly changing world. In the Viking Age, the stinging nettle Urtica dioica was more than just a pesky plant. It was considered a plant of power. Despite its painful sting, the nettle was one of the most useful and highly respected herbs in Norse healing traditions. It grew in abundance in meadows, along forest edges, and near settlements, making it easily accessible to both healers and ordinary households. Its medicinal benefits were numerous, and its ability to thrive in harsh conditions mirrored the strength and resilience that the Vikings so greatly valued. Nettle was primarily used to treat conditions related to blood and vitality. The coronation was a moment of triumph, both for the new king and for Joan. From an obscure village, she had risen to command armies and to place a crown on a monarch's head. The people saw her not just as a heroine, but as a chosen messenger of God. Her presence had transformed the war from a political struggle into a spiritual cause. But success brought tension. With Charles now crowned, some at court questioned Joan's continued influence. Politics returned to the forefront. Joan had completed the task she was called to do, but she wasn't finished. Her next desire was to press forward to reclaim Paris. Yet the support she once commanded so easily was beginning to waver. After the coronation at Reims, Joan of Arc pushed for a bold new objective: the liberation of Paris, which was still under English and Burgundian control. For Joan, reclaiming the French capital wasn't just a political necessity. It was part of her divine mission to fully restore France to its rightful king. However, not everyone shared her sense of urgency. King Charles VII, newly crowned and politically cautious, hesitated. His advisors urged diplomacy, favoring a negotiated truce with the Burgundians. But Joan remained resolute. She believed that any delay would only strengthen the enemy and that God had already paved the way for victory. Eventually, Charles agreed to an assault on Paris, albeit without his full commitment. He provided limited troops and delayed the campaign, weakening the effort before it even began. Joan arrived outside the city in early September 1429 and prepared for battle. Paris was well defended, with strong walls and experienced English and Burgundian forces inside. On September 8th, she led an assault on the Porte Saint-Honoré, one of the city's main gates. As always, she carried her banner and fought at the front lines, encouraging the troops with prayers and determination. The fighting was fierce. The defenders rained down arrows and stones. However, for the poor, laborers, peasants, and beggars, there was maslin or black bread, often made from a mixture of rye, barley, oats, and whatever other grains were available. This bread was dense, coarse in texture, and sometimes bitter to the taste. During times of hardship, bakers might even stretch it with beans, peas, or chestnut flour. It was filling, undoubtedly, but also served as a constant reminder of one's place in society. In monasteries, bread varied depending on the specific order. Some monks consumed simple loaves in keeping with their vows of poverty, while wealthier institutions produced high-quality white bread for guests and ranking clergy. Bread was also employed as a social tool. During feasts, wealthy lords would often use trenchers, thick slices of stale bread, as plates. After the meal, these trenchers were either consumed by servants or given to the poor as charitable handouts. Charity was frequently dispensed in the form of bread, distributed at monastery gates or from the kitchens of noble households. A skilled baker had to fully understand these social divisions. They didn't simply bake one type of loaf. Instead, they produced multiple varieties daily to meet the diverse needs of the entire town. Bread was more than just nourishment. It embodied economy, social hierarchy, and identity, all baked into every crust. In a world where most people lived on very little, bread clearly defined who had more and who merely survived on less. Being a baker in medieval Europe was not solely a matter of skill. It was also governed by law. Bread was considered so essential to life that its production was heavily regulated by local authorities and trade guilds. For a baker, failing to adhere to the rules didn't simply mean bad business. It could lead to public humiliation, the loss of their livelihood, or even imprisonment. In most towns and cities, guilds exerted control over the profession. She was making a professional one. It was a visual billboard that screamed, "I'm not a respectable matron, and I am available for negotiation." Proper Roman women wore the stola, a long, layered dress that basically said, "My husband controls my dowry, and I go to bed at 9 p.m. Prostitutes, on the other hand, were denied the stola by law and required to wear a toga, often short, brightly colored, and intentionally flashy. Think less Grecian goddess, more easily visible from across the forum. The look was usually accessorized with cheap jewelry, bronze or glass beads, maybe some loud earrings. The goal wasn't elegance. It was visibility. When you're competing with 20 other women in a 100-meter radius, subtlety is a luxury you just can't afford. Footwear was likely simple sandals or maybe even barefoot, depending on your location and your budget. Comfort wasn't a priority. You were going to spend a lot of the day standing, walking, and occasionally sprinting away from a bad client or an overly zealous moralist. Hair was its own whole ordeal. Roman prostitutes often curled and dyed their hair, sometimes wearing wigs, especially blonde ones imported from Gaul. Blonde hair had a certain exotic appeal in Rome, kind of like imported luxury soap, only more alive. And let's not forget the finishing touches. Makeup. Pale face powder to really contrast with red lips and cheeks, and thick kohl eyeliner to make your eyes pop. Or, at the very least, look less sleep-deprived. Once fully dressed, you looked obvious, and that was precisely the point. In a city of 1 million people, your outfit was your business card. If it made you look bold, scandalous, and, most importantly, economically available, then congratulations. You were ready for another glorious day of being judged by society while simultaneously being actively funded by it. So you're dressed, painted, perfumed, and hopefully not too hungover. But the divine pantheon did have a few deities who were, shall we say, more understanding when it came to your line of work. First, there was Venus, the goddess of love, beauty, and making generally poor choices. Plenty of prostitutes had small altars dedicated to her in their rooms. They'd offer flowers, perfume, or maybe just a coin, hoping to attract some wealth, charm, or at the very least, clients who didn't smell like they'd been boiled in a goat stew. Then you had Fortuna, the goddess of luck. Considering how unpredictable your daily earnings could be, ranging from a gold bracelet to 3 moldy grapes and a promise, Fortuna was kind of a big deal. You might wear a charm with her image on it, or just quickly whisper a prayer before some customer with way too many rings and suspiciously clean sandals walked in. But religion wasn't all about the glitter and the flirting. There was a darker side to belief, including superstition, omens, and magical ways to fight back. Because when you were in doubt, the spirits were always a good scapegoat. You might burn incense to keep the evil eye away, tie red cords around your ankle for protection, or even hire a professional to curse a rival prostitute's hairline. And don't laugh, because curse tablets, called depictions, have been discovered all over Roman brothel districts. A lot of them read like ancient Yelp revenge reviews. May her tongue rot. May her clients dry up. May she trip in the street and land face first in donkey dung. If you were enslaved, you might also pray to Mercury, the god of commerce and transactions. Let's be real here, your life was basically one long receipt. And if you were lucky enough to save up enough for your freedom, Libertas, the goddess of liberty, would get a private altar and a slightly more expensive candle. All this spiritual stuff wasn't just some tradition, it was about surviving with a little flair. Whether burned, boiled, or brewed, juniper was used to purify the body, the air, and even the spirit. Juniper berries were commonly used as a diuretic and a remedy for urinary tract infections. When consumed as a tea or decoction, they stimulated kidney function, helping the body to flush out excess water and harmful substances. This made them especially useful during illnesses that involved swelling, bloating, or lingering fevers. The berries also had mild antiseptic properties, allowing them to address infections from within, a crucial function in an age with no antibiotics. For respiratory issues, juniper smoke played a vital role. Healers would burn dried juniper branches and let the smoke fill a room or a tent, believing it could drive out disease. This wasn't just symbolic. The antimicrobial compounds in juniper smoke helped disinfect the air. During outbreaks of sickness or after a death, Viking homes and ships might be cleansed in this way. The practice was both practical and spiritual, banishing what could be seen and what could not. In steam baths and sweat lodges, a tradition shared across many northern European cultures, juniper branches were sometimes laid on the hot stones or added to the water. As the vapor rose, it carried the sharp, invigorating scent of the plant, opening the lungs and inducing heavy sweating. This was thought to cleanse the body of toxins and the soul of imbalance, reconnecting a person with the rhythms of nature and health. Juniper also held ritual importance. Branches might be hung over doorways to ward off evil or carried in small bundles by travelers for protection. Its strong, earthy fragrance symbolized resilience, and its presence in healing was a reminder that purification was as much about the unseen forces as it was about physical ailments. For Viking healers, juniper was not merely a remedy. From such humble beginnings, no one could have possibly imagined that this seemingly ordinary peasant girl, illiterate, unknown, and barely a teenager, would one day stand before kings, lead armies into battle, and challenge the might of empires. At the age of 13, Joan of Arc's life took a dramatic turn, changing forever the course of her destiny. She later testified that in the summer of 1425, while alone in her father's garden, she experienced a profound vision, accompanied by a voice that seemed to originate from beyond the earthly realm. At first, she was understandably frightened. The voice, surrounded by a dazzling light, was accompanied by the appearance of figures that she identified as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, 3 powerful and revered saints in Catholic tradition. These visions would continue to occur, growing in intensity and clarity over time. The message she received was clear and direct, but also extraordinary and almost unbelievable. She was chosen by God to help save France from its enemies. More specifically, her divinely ordained mission was to drive the English forces out of French territory and to ensure the coronation of Charles the Dauphin as the rightful king of France. It was a staggering revelation for a young peasant girl with no military experience, no formal education, and no social standing whatsoever. Joan initially told no one about her experiences. She kept the visions private, fearing disbelief, ridicule, or even punishment. However, the voices persisted, urging her to take action. Over the next few years, she became increasingly convinced that her mission was real and divinely inspired. She began to devote herself even more deeply to prayer, fasting, and other forms of religious discipline, believing that her own purity and unwavering obedience were essential for fulfilling God's will. By 1428, the political and military situation in France had deteriorated significantly. Viking healers would prepare nettle teas or broths to fight fatigue, iron deficiency, and general weakness. Rich in iron, calcium, and vitamin C, nettle acted as a natural tonic, which was especially important during the long winter months when fresh food was scarce and illnesses spread easily. Warriors recovering from battle wounds or children recovering from a fever were often given nettle to help them regain their strength. The leaves were either dried or cooked to reduce their sting, and then brewed into nourishing infusions. These drinks were believed to purify the blood, improve circulation, and help the body get rid of harmful substances. Nettle also had a mild diuretic effect, making it useful for treating fluid retention and joint pain, which were common issues among laborers and older members of the community. In external treatments, nettle was sometimes used in surprising ways. The practice of urtication, which involved striking sore limbs with fresh nettle stalks, was used to stimulate circulation and provide relief from arthritis or muscle stiffness. Although this method was painful, it was believed to bring warmth and life back to cold or stiff areas of the body. This method, while unusual by today's standards, was based on generations of observation and a deep belief in the plant's invigorating properties. Nettle also played practical roles beyond medicine. Its fibers were used to make rope, fishing nets, and even cloth, especially during times when flax or wool were in short supply. This dual utility, nourishing the body and supporting daily life, made nettle an integral part of Viking culture. Symbolically, nettle was a plant of resilience. It flourished in disturbed soil and returned year after year, regardless of how often it was cut back. In Norse society, where survival depended on both strength and adaptability, nettle embodied these values. Joan was struck by a crossbow bolt in the thigh but refused to leave the field. She continued to direct the battle from behind the lines, calling for another charge. But the attack stalled. With nightfall approaching and casualties mounting, Charles's commanders ordered a retreat, despite Joan's protests. The failed attack on Paris marked a turning point. Joan's reputation remained intact among the common soldiers and citizens, but at court, doubts began to surface. Her influence over royal policy started to wane. Charles, now king, no longer relied on her as he once had. Political interests, fear of provoking further conflict, and distrust of Joan's spiritual authority began to overshadow her earlier triumphs. Yet Joan remained undeterred. She continued to lead minor campaigns in the following months, capturing towns like Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier and La Chérite-sur-Loire, often financing these operations herself with donations from her supporters. But the tide was turning. Her vision of total victory clashed with the king's increasingly cautious stance. Despite her injuries, her dwindling support, and her growing political isolation, Joan remained convinced that her mission wasn't yet complete. She wouldn't stop until France was free. But in the shadows, betrayal and danger were closing in. In the spring of 1430, Joan of Arc continued her campaign. Though her position had become increasingly precarious, her successes on the battlefield hadn't translated into lasting political power. King Charles VII, now more focused on diplomacy than war, offered only lukewarm support. Joan, acting largely on her own initiative, turned her attention to the town of Compiègne, which was under threat from Burgundian forces. She arrived in May 1430, hoping to defend the city and rally the local population. But the odds were stacked against her. The Burgundians, allies of the English, were closing in with superior numbers. These guilds were associations of craftsmen who regulated quality, training, pricing, and supply. Bakers' guilds established strict standards for the weight, size, and ingredients of bread. These standards were not optional. They were rigorously enforced through regular inspections and harsh penalties. Aspiring bakers often had to complete apprenticeships lasting several years before they were permitted to operate their own ovens. Guild membership offered both privilege and protection. It granted bakers the right to sell their goods in the town market and ensured a degree of economic stability. However, it also bound them to a system of accountability. If a baker was caught selling underweight loaves or using substandard ingredients, guild officials could fine them, suspend their operations, or even revoke their right to bake altogether. Beyond the guilds, municipal authorities also monitored bread quality. In England, for example, the assize of bread and ale, a law dating back to the 13th century, dictated precisely how much bread a customer should receive for a set price, which adjusted with fluctuations in grain costs. Officials known as bread weighers or ale tasters conducted surprise inspections and reported any violations. Punishments for breaking bread laws could be severe and dramatic. Some bakers were pilloried, locked into public stocks where they were subjected to mockery or pelted with stale bread and rotten food. Others were forced to parade through town with substandard loaves strung around their necks. In extreme cases, repeat offenders could be banned from the trade or exiled from the town entirely. These rules weren't solely about fairness. They were also about survival. Bread riots were a very real threat during times of famine or inflation. Town leaders understood that if people suspected they were being cheated out of their daily bread, social unrest could quickly follow. Now comes the fun part. Drumming up business in a city where everyone wants sex but pretends to be absolutely shocked when they find out it's for sale. In ancient Rome, marketing wasn't exactly subtle. There were no pamphlets, no websites, and definitely no branding consultants. If you wanted clients, you had to be seen, be loud, and ideally be immortalized in graffiti. Let's start with location strategy. If you worked out of a Lupener brothel, your office was already pretty much built for maximum visibility. Brothels were often located near bathhouses, markets, or drinking establishments. In short, anywhere people might already be sweaty, bored, or easily persuaded. Think ancient foot traffic optimization. Standing in the doorway wearing your finest look-at-me outfit, you'd call out to passers-by with a mixture of flattery, negotiation, and maybe a few time-sensitive offers. 2 denarii if you're quick. Hey, it might sound desperate, but rent was due, and the next girl over just dropped her rate to 1. If you were a freelancer, it was all about maximizing roaming visibility. You might hover near temples because nothing says divine inspiration quite like temptation. Or hang around taverns, ready to flirt with a tipsy legionary who still had some coin left and questionable judgment. But perhaps the most bizarre and weirdly effective form of Roman advertising was wall graffiti. Yes, Pompeii has immortalized the sheer genius of ancient street marketing. Brothel walls were plastered with handwritten reviews like, "Maridimus gave me the best time of my life," or "Felicia, 2 denarii, very fast service." These weren't just acts of vandalism. They were ancient Yelp reviews, unfiltered, unregulated, and very, very public. Some women even paid someone to write their name and specialty somewhere highly visible, usually near tavern entrances or on columns. When Rome gave you judgment, disease, and rude senators, the gods were basically your HR department. Mostly useless, occasionally helpful, and always willing to accept offerings. Love in the Roman world of prostitution was complicated. At best, it was a nice little fantasy, and at worst, it was just another way to lose money in a tunic. Clients would fall in love all the time, or at least claim they did, usually after a few cups of wine and half a story about their mother. Some of them were being sincere, some were just drunk, and others were trying to get a discount. "But baby, I'm different," they'd say, grabbing your hand like a dramatic poet, and you'd just nod politely while mentally figuring out how much they still owed you. Some of the women working would return those feelings, or at least pretend to. Emotional labor was part of the job. Smile, listen, and try to ignore the fact that his toga smells like despair. With a few clients, you might actually develop something real, some kind of attachment, affection, or maybe just a mutual sense of exhaustion. But more often than not, romance was a dangerous distraction, especially when you remembered that Rome legally considered you infamized, which meant you couldn't legally marry a citizen, even if you wanted to. That didn't stop people from trying, though. There are stories of prostitutes who fell head over heels for their regulars, who were promised freedom, marriage, and a house with a garden, only to be dumped the second some other woman with better eyeliner came along. But there were also clients who truly adored their favorite companion, showering them with gifts, poems, and sometimes actual manumission, the legal act of freeing a slave. Those stories do exist, but they were definitely the exception, not the rule. Real bonds were more likely to form between the prostitutes themselves. You worked side by side, put up with the same insults, and shared the same lice. It was a symbol of renewal and defense, a guardian plant that stood between the fragile human body and the chaotic forces of the world. Its sharp needles and potent berries helped them keep sickness at bay, one breath of smoke or sip of tea at a time. Among the many herbs known to Viking healers, meadowsweet, Filipendula ulmaria, was particularly valued for its ability to ease pain and reduce inflammation. Found in damp meadows and along riverbanks, this fragrant plant with creamy white flowers was a staple in early Germanic and Norse herbal medicine. Though they lacked modern terminology, Viking healers recognized that some plants had the power to cool fevers, relieve discomfort, and help the body recover more gently. Meadowsweet was often used to treat headaches, joint pain, and digestive problems. The flowers and leaves were dried and steeped into teas, which were given to patients suffering from fevers or general aches, common complaints in a harsh climate where physical labor and exposure were part of daily life. The herb's soothing effects made it an essential remedy during times of illness and recovery. Unbeknownst to the Vikings, meadowsweet contains compounds similar to salicylic acid, the basis for modern aspirin. This natural pain-relieving ability explains why it was so effective and frequently used. Healers didn't know the chemistry, but they knew the results. Less fever, reduced swelling, and relief from discomfort. These benefits were especially important during the winter months, when colds, joint pain, and respiratory infections were widespread. For digestive issues, meadowsweet was considered a gentle treatment for nausea, heartburn, and stomach cramps. Its calming properties helped settle the stomach, and it was sometimes combined with other herbs like chamomile or mint, if available, to create a broader treatment. The plant's sweet scent also made it a comforting addition to healing rituals, which often blended the sensory with the medicinal. The English forces had captured a large portion of northern France, and the strategically important city of Orleans was under siege. The Dauphin remained uncrowned, and his legitimacy as the rightful heir to the French throne was increasingly in question. Joan, now 16 years old, believed that the time had come for her to act on the instructions she had received from her visions. She traveled to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs and requested an audience with the local commander, Robert de Baudricourt, claiming that she had a message of vital importance for the Dauphin himself. At first, Baudricourt and his men simply laughed her off. A teenage girl claiming to be guided by divine voices was hardly taken seriously in a world of hardened soldiers and political intrigue. However, Joan was remarkably persistent. She returned again and again, speaking with a conviction and unwavering faith that unsettled some and impressed others. Eventually, after hearing reports of her growing reputation for piety and learning that she had accurately predicted a significant military setback at Orleans before the news had even reached the town, Baudricourt relented. He agreed to send her, dressed in men's clothing for protection and accompanied by an armed escort, to meet with the Dauphin. Joan's remarkable journey from a simple peasant child to a military envoy had begun, fueled by her unwavering faith, her divinely inspired visions, and an unshakable sense of destiny. In early 1429, Joan of Arc arrived in Chinon, where Charles, the uncrowned Dauphin of France, held his court. The journey had been long and fraught with danger. She had traveled more than 300 miles through enemy-held territory, disguised as a man to avoid unwanted attention and potential assault. When she finally stood before the royal court, she was met with a mixture of skepticism, curiosity, and outright disbelief. Charles, uncertain of her true motives and wary of potential trickery, decided to put her to the test. For the healer, it was a reminder that even the most painful plants could offer healing, and that power often came from things that initially seemed harmful. Viking herbal medicine was never formally written down during that time. Instead, it existed in the spoken word, in chants passed down from mother to daughter, in gestures exchanged among wise women, and in the quiet work of healers who combined tradition, observation, and belief. These practices created a body of knowledge that was deeply rooted in both the natural environment and Norse cosmology. To treat illness in the Viking world meant more than just curing the body. It meant restoring balance to the individual, the household, and the invisible connections that linked them to the gods. Healers in Viking society worked with what the land offered. They knew which herbs to gather in the spring, which roots to dry in the autumn, and how to preserve medicinal plants throughout the long winter months. Yarrow, angelica, birch, juniper, meadowsweet, mugwort, garlic, and nettle each played a specific role, but all were part of a larger system of understanding the body in harmony with nature. Treatments were physical, certainly, but also symbolic. Illness might be viewed as a disruption in fate, a challenge from the gods, or an imbalance between the seen and unseen worlds. Women played a central role in maintaining and passing down this knowledge. Within longhouses and farmsteads, female healers oversaw the care of families and communities. Some women took on more specialized roles, such as that of the vulva, seers who combined healing with prophecy and were often called upon during times of crisis. Their work often involved sacred herbs, spiritual rituals, and appeals to divine forces, such as Frigg, air, or Freya. Healing was not just a duty. It was an act of connection between mortal life and the mythic world. On May 23rd, Joan led a small force in a sortie to challenge the besiegers and disrupt their lines. As the battle unfolded outside the city walls, French forces were pushed back. Joan remained behind to cover the retreat, determined to protect her soldiers. In the chaos, the city gates closed too soon. Joan and a few companions were trapped outside. Surrounded by Burgundian cavalry, she fought valiantly until she was pulled from her horse and taken captive. Her capture was a devastating blow, not only for Joan herself, but also for the morale of the French people. The girl who had once lifted the siege of Orleans and crowned a king now found herself a prisoner. The Burgundians held Joan for months, treating her more as a political prize than a common captive. She was eventually sold to the English for a large sum, an act that confirmed her status as a threat to their cause. The English viewed her not only as a military adversary, but also as a dangerous symbol of resistance and divine legitimacy. Throughout her captivity, Joan attempted to escape more than once. In one instance, she jumped from a high tower, injuring herself badly but surviving. Even in chains, her will remained unbroken. She demanded to be treated as a noble prisoner of war, not as a criminal or heretic. But the English had other plans. They didn't intend to hold her indefinitely. They meant to destroy her credibility, her image, and the power she had come to represent. Her trial was already being prepared. Joan's capture at Compiègne marked the beginning of her final, most harrowing chapter. She had risen from obscurity to the heights of power only to be betrayed, abandoned, and delivered into the hands of her enemies. But her story was far from over. After months in Burgundian custody, Joan of Arc was transferred to English hands and brought to Rouen, the English administrative capital in occupied Normandy. For the medieval baker, then, precision was not just a point of pride. It was a legal obligation. Every loaf had to meet the established standards, because in the eyes of both the guild and the town, baking was not simply a trade. It was considered a vital public service. Running a medieval bakehouse was not just demanding. It was also inherently dangerous. Fire was both a necessity and a constant threat. Ovens had to reach incredibly high temperatures to properly bake dense loaves, and maintaining that intense heat required burning large quantities of wood, often in enclosed spaces constructed of timber, thatch, or stone that had been blackened by years of accumulated smoke. Most bakehouses were constructed with a large, dome-shaped oven built from clay or brick, positioned against an outer wall to facilitate airflow and loading. To heat the oven, bakers lit a roaring fire directly inside it. This was not a casual campfire. It was an intense blaze designed to superheat the thick walls, enabling them to radiate warmth for hours. Once the fire had burned for a sufficient duration, bakers would carefully rake out the embers, clean the hearth with a damp rag or a sand-soaked brush, and then commence baking. However, even a momentary lapse in vigilance could lead to catastrophe. Embers could escape, thatched roofs could ignite, and in densely packed towns and cities, a bakehouse fire could spread with terrifying speed. For this reason, many towns mandated that bakehouses be located on the outskirts or built with specific fire-resistant materials, if the baker could afford them. Bakers also faced significant health risks. Prolonged exposure to intense heat and smoke took a heavy toll on their lungs and skin. The constant heavy lifting of flour sacks and the tireless kneading of massive batches of dough wore down their bodies over time. Burns were a common occurrence on arms, hands, and faces, earned while loading and unloading hot loaves with long wooden peels. Others let their clients do the writing, which, as you might expect, ranged from glowing praise to confused haikus about being robbed. All of this made one thing abundantly clear. A prostitute's survival depended as much on marketing as it did on skill. If people didn't know your name, your rates, and your approximate level of enthusiasm, someone else was definitely getting the business. Because in ancient Rome, as now, the secret to success wasn't always about talent. Sometimes it was just about having better PR. So you've advertised yourself. You've got the outfit, the eyeliner, and just enough confidence to fake a good mood. Now it's time to talk pricing. The part where ancient Rome pretends to be a free market while secretly judging you. Anyway, let's be clear. There was no union. Rates were set by supply, demand, and whatever you could get away with before someone bartered you down with a loaf of stale bread. For street-level workers or those in lower-end lupanars, prices could be as low as 1 or 2 asses. A small bronze coin that wouldn't even get you a glass of wine. That's right. Some clients were paying less than the cost of a decent lunch. If that feels depressing, just remember that some women accepted food, sandals, or even promises as payment. Yes, in a city with an empire's worth of coinage, IOUs still existed. On the other hand, high-end prostitutes, often called meretresses, operated more like luxury brands. These women could charge in denarii silver coins, sometimes multiple per client, especially if they had skills beyond the bedroom. Conversation, music, poetry, basic literacy, anything that let a client believe they weren't just hiring company, but taste. Some prostitutes even had niches, not architectural ones, but marketing ones. Maybe you specialized in working with sailors, or performing erotic dances, or reciting poetry during the act. Don't laugh. Ovid probably inspired someone. Some of those friendships turned into real sisterhoods. Others became quiet romantic partnerships hidden away from the Roman patriarchy, which was convinced that women couldn't possibly fall in love with anyone except some dude with a sword collection. And of course, there were the lies you told yourself. That someday you'd quit. That your best client would actually take you away. That if you could just save a little bit more, you'd open up a perfume shop in Austria and never look back. Maybe it wasn't true, but in Rome, everyone had a fantasy. Yours just came with better lighting and lower expectations. In the Roman world of sex work, beauty was currency and youth was the exchange rate. So, what happened when the blush faded? The clients stopped hanging around, and your joints started popping louder than your earrings? Simple. You aged out, but you didn't just disappear. Some women, who had saved carefully, or by some miracle had a client with both money and follow-through, managed to buy their freedom if they were enslaved and start over. The luckiest ones opened taverns or bathhouses, renting out rooms to the next generation of desperate optimists. Others became madams or Leni, the brothel version of upper management. Less action, more yelling. As a Lena, you didn't need to be young or pretty. You needed to be sharp, intimidating, and fluent in threats involving sandals and unpaid debts. You made the schedules, kept the books, and made sure the curtains were only mildly horrifying. Clients were afraid of you. The workers pretended to respect you. And the ediles just sighed when they saw you coming. Some retired sex workers turned to fortune-telling. After all, when you've heard every confession and watched every mistake walk through the door, predicting doom becomes second nature. A few became unofficial therapists, wise women or herbalists who offered advice laced with sarcasm and slightly incorrect medical suggestions. Metasuite's role wasn't limited to physical healing. Its delicate, almost ethereal presence tied it to the natural cycles of growth and decay, life and death. As with many Viking remedies, its use may have included symbolic gestures, such as laying its flowers near the ill or including it in burial rites to ease the journey to the afterlife. Some sagas and later folk traditions refer to sweet-smelling herbs as gifts from the gods or spirits of the land. In a culture that respected strength but understood the necessity of healing, meadowsweet was a quiet yet powerful ally. It helped warriors rest, allowed children to recover, and gave the elderly comfort in their final years. For the healer, it was one of the gentlest and most reliable tools in their care. Mugwort, Artemisia vulgaris, held a special place in the Viking healer's practice, not only as a medicinal herb, but also as a spiritual tool. Known across northern Europe for its bitter aroma and silvery leaves, mugwort was considered one of the most sacred plants in Germanic tradition. For Viking societies, where healing was never just physical, mugwort served as a bridge between the body, the mind, and the unseen world. Medically, mugwort was used to treat a wide range of ailments. It helped with digestive problems, menstrual irregularities, and fatigue. The tea made from its leaves was used to ease stomach cramps, stimulate appetite, and support the liver. Viking women, in particular, relied on mugwort to regulate their cycles and aid with childbirth. In a world without midwives or formal obstetrics, the healer's knowledge of such herbs was vital for survival during pregnancy and delivery. Mugwort also had powerful nervine properties, meaning it calmed the nervous system. For warriors who experienced restlessness or nightmares, mugwort tea or smoke was thought to restore inner balance and protect the mind. To begin with, he disguised himself in plain clothes and hid among his courtiers. Joan, who had never seen him before, immediately picked him out from the crowd and addressed him directly as the Dauphin. Witnesses were utterly astonished. She reportedly told him details about his life and thoughts that only he and his closest advisors would have known, possibly regarding a private prayer or a secret doubt that he harbored. For many in the court, this was the first compelling sign that something extraordinary and perhaps even supernatural was at work. Still, Charles remained cautious. He ordered that Joan be thoroughly examined by theologians and church officials in Poitiers. For several weeks, she was subjected to intense questioning about her visions, her moral character, and her religious doctrine. She was, after all, just a teenage girl being grilled by some of the most learned and respected men in France. Yet, she answered their questions with remarkable composure, intelligence, and unwavering conviction. Her virginity was also tested, as it was widely believed that her purity was essential for her to fulfill her divine mission. The examiners ultimately found nothing heretical or blasphemous in her claims and noted her remarkable character and sharp intelligence, especially considering her lack of formal education. The court's advisors eventually concluded that she could be sent to Orleans with the army. But first, Joan requested something symbolic, something that would clearly signal her role, not merely as a soldier, but as a divine emissary. She asked for a banner to be made. The banner she received was white, embroidered with an image of Christ in judgment and the words, Jesus Maria, Jesus and Mary. It would become her most treasured possession, and she carried it into every battle, declaring that she preferred the banner to the sword. With the spread of Christianity and the decline of Norse paganism, much of this oral tradition either faded away or was absorbed into new religious frameworks. Monasteries adopted and preserved some of the herbs and techniques, while others disappeared or became mixed up with superstition and fear. However, echoes of Viking herbal medicine can still be found today in Scandinavian folk healing, in modern herbalism, and in the renewed interest in ancestral plant knowledge. The legacy of Viking healers lies not only in the herbs they used, but also in the worldview they maintained that nature holds power, that healing is both physical and spiritual, and that wisdom often resides in the hands of those who listen to the land. Joan of Arc was born in the winter of 1412 in the small village of Domremy, a quiet hamlet in northeastern France situated near the border of Burgundy. At that time, France was divided by war and civil unrest. The 100 Years' War between England and France had been going on for decades, and northern France was caught in the crossfire. Joan was born into this turbulent environment. She was the daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romee, devout peasants who raised their children in the Roman Catholic faith. Her family lived a modest life. They owned a small piece of land, a few animals, and depended on farming to make a living. Joan was not taught to read or write, like most girls of her social class. But she was known from an early age for her hard work and deep religious devotion. She spent much of her childhood helping around the house, tending sheep and going to church. Her world was humble and deeply rooted in faith. The voices she would later claim to hear would come to someone who already spent hours in prayer and contemplation. Domremy itself was a contested area. Although it was technically loyal to the French crown, it bordered Burgundian territory, a faction allied with the English. The threat of violence was constant. There, beginning in January 1431, she faced a formal ecclesiastical trial, not as a prisoner of war, but as a heretic, a designation that allowed her captors to strip her of honor and execute her under church law. The trial was orchestrated by the English, but carried out by a panel of pro-English French clergy, led by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a staunch opponent of Joan and loyal to the Burgundian cause. Its true goal wasn't justice, but the destruction of Joan's legacy. By branding her a heretic, the English sought to undermine the legitimacy of Charles VII, whose coronation she had made possible. Joan was held in a secular prison, guarded by male soldiers, a direct violation of church law. She was denied access to legal counsel, threatened with torture, and interrogated repeatedly, often for hours at a time without rest or support. Despite being a 19-year-old peasant girl facing some of the most educated men in France, she defended herself with remarkable intelligence and composure. Over the course of several months, she was questioned about her visions, her clothing, her faith, and her role in the war. The judges focused especially on her claim of hearing divine voices and her habit of wearing men's clothing, an act considered both heretical and unnatural by church standards. Despite their pressure, Joan remained firm in her testimony. She maintained that her voices came from God, that she had acted in obedience to divine command, and that she had always remained faithful to the church. At one point, when asked whether she believed she was in God's grace, she famously responded, "If I am not, may God place me there. If I am, may God keep me there." It was a powerful answer, neither arrogant nor self-condemning, and one that impressed even her inquisitors. But the outcome was never truly in question. Political necessity outweighed truth. Some cities had communal bakehouses, particularly in poorer neighborhoods. Families would prepare their dough at home and bring it to a central oven managed by a professional baker. While this system conserved fuel and reduced fire hazards in private homes, it introduced its own set of risks. Loaves could be burned, stolen, or tampered with. Bakers were held responsible for the integrity of each household's bread, and any negligence could lead to formal complaints. Because bread was such a vital staple, a disruption to a bakehouse, whether due to fire, illness, or accident, could have repercussions across the entire town. It wasn't just the baker who suffered. The entire community felt the loss. Despite these inherent dangers, the bakehouse remained the beating heart of daily life. It was a place of labor, heat, and vital routine, where risk and reward burned side by side with every glowing loaf. While the popular image of the medieval baker often centers on male guild members and apprentices, women played a critical, if frequently overlooked, role in the daily production of bread. In many towns and villages, especially outside major cities, women were the primary bakers for both their families and the broader community. Their presence in the bakehouse was essential to keeping the ovens hot and the population fed. In rural areas, household baking was typically done by women. They baked for their families using communal ovens or small hearths. And in times of surplus, they might sell loaves at the market or directly from their doorstep. For many women, this side trade in bread provided a rare source of independent income. In cities as well, widows of bakers were often permitted to continue their husbands' businesses, sometimes becoming successful bakery owners in their own right. Guilds were generally male-dominated, but not entirely exclusive. In certain regions, particularly in parts of Germany and France, female bakers were formally recognized. The more unique your brand, the less replaceable you became. Repeat clients might get a discount or not. It depended entirely on whether they paid on time or smelled like fermented cabbage. And if you worked under a pimp or brothel owner, a hefty cut of your earnings disappeared before you even saw a single coin. Some women were enslaved, which meant they didn't get paid at all, just food, shelter, and a vague promise that one day they might buy their freedom if they somehow won the Roman lottery. Welcome to the Lupanar, the Roman brothel. It's not luxurious, but it has walls, which already makes it more dignified than working behind a tavern. Technically, it's a place of business. Realistically, it's a sweaty stone maze of bad decisions. The term lupanar comes from lupa, meaning she-wolf, which the Romans used as slang for prostitute. That's right. Your job title was also your animal comparison. Not exactly empowering, but at least it's consistent. Most lupanars were two-story buildings crammed between bathhouses and bars, perfect for catching foot traffic from half-drunk senators and bored sailors. Inside, you've got a narrow hallway lined with tiny rooms, each equipped with a stone bed, a thin mattress, and just enough space to reconsider your life choices. No doors, just curtains for that open floor plan vibe. Privacy, that's something rich matrons had. You've got damp linen and the sound of someone snoring through your shared wall. You're not alone, of course. A proper lupanar had several working women and one delightful parasite known as the leno, pimp, or lena, madam. Their job was to take a cut of your earnings, promise repairs that never happened, and occasionally yell things like, "Work faster, he's important." Clients ranged from nervous teenagers to sweaty legionaries, and balding senators claiming this was just a philosophical visit. Some were in and out faster than a dropped denarius. But a lot of them simply kept working, because Rome wasn't exactly in the habit of handing out pensions to women who'd spent 20 years in a toga. Older prostitutes still had clients, they just changed their marketing a bit. Less blushing flower, more experienced, discreet, and tolerates poetry. Physical appearance still mattered, but so did reputation. A woman known for her conversation, kindness, or mind-blowing astrology readings could stay in demand long after she was past her prime. And for those with no savings, no patrons, and no lucky breaks, the options weren't exactly great. You begged, cleaned temples, or just kept working until your hands turned into shriveled-up olives. Rome didn't care how you got old, just that you did it quietly. But here's the truth that they didn't carve into marble. For a lot of these women, just surviving was the achievement. And if you made it to old age with your wit still intact and at least one working sandal, you were already a legend. When people think about ancient Rome, they picture marble statues, grand speeches, and emperors with questionable family histories. What they almost never picture is the woman leaning in a brothel doorway, adjusting her wig, and mentally calculating how many coins she needs to avoid starving next week. Roman prostitutes didn't just work in the shadows. They've been kept there by history, carefully edited out of the noble narrative so schoolchildren can learn about aqueducts without asking awkward questions. Yet, they were everywhere. In graffiti, legal records, satire, poems, love letters, curse tablets, and receipts. Yes, actual receipts. They were a regular part of daily Roman life, even though society treated them like morally contagious wallpaper. What history usually gets wrong is the assumption that these women were either powerless victims or morally bankrupt seductresses. Sleep, which was often disturbed after battle or illness, could be coaxed back by burning dried mugwort near the bedside or placing it under the pillow. This wasn't simply superstition. Many aromatic herbs do have mild sedative effects. But beyond its medicinal uses, mugwort was strongly linked to ritual and magic. Viking healers and wise women, often referred to as volar or psykener, used mugwort in ceremonies to invoke dreams, protection, or visions. It was sometimes burned during rites of seer, the Norse form of trance magic and prophecy. The rising smoke was believed to carry prayers to the gods or ward off harmful spirits. Healers might also use mugwort during solstice ceremonies, seasonal changes, or in times of emotional distress. A bundle of mugwort could be hung over the door for protection, carried in a pouch during travel, or placed on the body during healing rituals. Its bitter scent and strong energy made it a plant of thresholds, used when the body or soul was in transition. To the Viking healer, mugwort was more than a plant. It was an ancient ally, one that stood at the intersection of medicine and magic, guiding the sick not only toward physical recovery, but toward spiritual realignment with the world and the gods. Among the most practical and powerful remedies in the Viking healer's collection was garlic, Allium sativum. Though not native to Scandinavia, Garlic had long been traded across Europe and may have reached the Viking world through early contact with the British Isles, Frankish territories, and Eastern markets. Its strong scent and potent medicinal qualities made it an essential part of early Norse medicine, especially for infections, parasites, and protection against disease. Garlic's antibacterial and antifungal properties were well known, even if not scientifically understood. She was also fitted with a custom-made suit of gleaming white armor and given a sword, which she claimed to have been divinely led to discover hidden behind the altar of a chapel in St. Catherine de Fierbois. With her armor, her banner, and a company of dedicated soldiers, Joan prepared to march towards Orleans. She was just 17 years old, young, relatively untrained in warfare, and utterly convinced that God had sent her to save France. Her arrival at the besieged city would mark the beginning of one of the most legendary military campaigns in European history. By the spring of 1429, the strategically vital city of Orleans had been under siege by the English forces for several months. Its fall would have opened a clear path to the heart of France, likely leading to the collapse of French resistance. Morale among the French troops and citizens was at an all-time low. Supplies were dwindling rapidly, and the Dauphin's cause teetered precariously on the edge of complete defeat. Then Joan of Arc arrived. She entered the city on April 29th, greeted by cheering crowds who saw her as nothing short of a miracle sent by God. Clad in her shining white armor and riding a magnificent white horse, she quickly became a potent symbol of hope and divine favor. Her presence alone seemed to reinvigorate the French troops and the city's besieged citizens. Although she had no formal military training, Joan spoke with boldness and unwavering authority, urging immediate and decisive action against the English fortifications. French commanders, initially hesitant to take orders from a teenage peasant girl, soon found themselves drawn to her unwavering conviction and her palpable sense of divine purpose. Joan advocated for an aggressive strategy, claiming that her voices had promised her victory. Despite her youth and lack of experience, she fearlessly rode into battle alongside the soldiers, often placing herself in the most dangerous positions. Raids by Anglo-Burgundian forces occasionally swept through the region, destroying crops and burning homes. Joan would have grown up hearing stories of heroism and defeat, of saints and warriors, of kings and traitors. Her early years were shaped by instability, fear, and a longing for peace. Despite the fear that hung over France, Joan's childhood wasn't devoid of community. She was well-liked in the village and described by her neighbors as kind, pious, and unusually serious for her age. She often prayed at a nearby chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary, where she would later claim her divine mission began. These years laid the spiritual and emotional groundwork for what was to come. Her faith, her loyalty to the king, and her sense of purpose were not formed in the royal court, but in the fields and chapels of her village. From such humble beginnings, no one could have imagined that this peasant girl, illiterate, unknown, and barely a teenager, would one day stand before kings, lead armies, and challenge the might of empires. At the age of 13, Joan of Arc's life took a dramatic turn. She later testified that in the summer of 1425, while alone in her father's garden, she experienced a vision, accompanied by a voice that seemed to originate from beyond this world. At first, she was frightened. The voice, surrounded by a dazzling light, was accompanied by the appearance of figures she identified as Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, three revered saints in the Catholic tradition. These visions would continue, growing in intensity and clarity over time. The message was clear, but extraordinary. She had been chosen by God to help save France. More specifically, her divine mission was to drive the English out of French territory and to ensure the coronation of Charles the Dauphin as the rightful king of France. It was a staggering revelation for a young peasant girl with no military experience, no formal education, and no social standing. Joan was eventually condemned for heresy, based largely on her refusal to renounce her visions and her insistence on wearing male attire, which she had resumed in prison for protection. Her sentence was death. The girl who had once lifted the nation, or so the court believed, would now be silenced, not by defeat in battle, but by a group of men determined to erase her from the historical record. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was led to the marketplace in Rouen, tied to a wooden stake and burned alive. She was only 19 years old at the time. As the flames engulfed her, she reportedly called out the name of Jesus repeatedly, and the nation, they believed, would now be silenced, not through military defeat, but by a court of men determined to erase her existence from the historical record. Or so they thought. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was led to the marketplace in Rouen, bound to a wooden stake and burned alive. She was a mere 19 years old. As the flames engulfed her, she reportedly cried out the name of Jesus repeatedly and pleaded for a cross to be held before her. A soldier, moved by her bravery, offered her a small wooden cross. Witnesses recounted that she faced death with remarkable composure. Her execution was intended as a definitive end, a warning to others, a suppression of a perceived dangerous symbol. However, it had the complete opposite effect. Instead of being forgotten, Joan transformed into a martyr. Even English and Burgundian observers were deeply troubled by the spectacle. Some were moved to tears, while others openly questioned whether the church had committed a grave injustice. One of the English clerics present is said to have exclaimed, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." In the years that followed, Joan's image only gained strength. Her unwavering faith, her courage on the battlefield, and her dignified defense during her trial became the cornerstones of a powerful and enduring legend. Women could inherit licenses, run bakeries, and train apprentices, including their daughters or nieces. Some even petitioned for full guild rights and succeeded, although this required navigating significant legal and social challenges. Women in bakehouses performed the same grueling work as men, including mixing dough in massive troughs, hauling water and flour, managing oven temperatures, and selling bread in markets. Many also worked as bread sellers, walking through the streets with baskets balanced on their heads or carts loaded with loaves. These women were often the face of the bakery, interacting directly with customers and managing daily sales. Despite their substantial labor contributions, women were often paid less and received less recognition than their male counterparts. They were also more vulnerable to accusations of selling underweight bread or poor-quality loaves and faced harsh penalties for any infractions. Still, their contributions were essential, especially during times of war or plague when men were absent, and communities relied on women to sustain the food supply. Baking also intersected with motherhood and caretaking. A woman who could bake well was seen as capable and respectable, responsible for keeping her household fed, preserving culinary traditions, and passing down valuable knowledge. In many families, recipes and baking techniques were handed down from mother to daughter like cherished heirlooms. In every corner of medieval society, from noble kitchens to village ovens, women shaped the world through bread. Though historical records often neglect to name them, their hands were among the first to touch the dough that nourished entire towns. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't simply a foodstuff. It was considered sacred. Few institutions influenced bread making more profoundly than the church, which not only consumed vast quantities of bread, but also shaped its symbolism, regulation, and distribution. Others tried to talk about their poetry, which, frankly, was worse. During downtime, you'd sit near the entrance, giving your best, "I'm flirty but dead inside" expression while calling out to passing foot traffic. Marketing was mostly volume-based. 2 coins special today. I'll pretend to listen. And yes, the walls were covered in graffiti, ancient Yelp reviews etched lovingly into the plaster. Felix was here twice. Or Thais gives a good time. Occasionally, someone got artsy and drew pictures. Proportions were rarely accurate. Confidence, however, was never lacking. Working in a lupanar wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. A roof over your head, a bed if you squint, and, if nothing else, you'd always have a front row seat to humanity's weirdest parade. Not every Roman prostitute worked in a lupanar. Some preferred or were assigned to the equally glamorous world of taverns. If the brothel was a chaotic office cubicle, the tavern was more like working in an open-air startup, but with more vomit and fewer stock options. Taverns Caponi or Pompeii were where Rome's finest drunkards, merchants, off-duty soldiers, and guys with gambling debts gathered to drink, shout, and pretend they understood Virgil. For prostitutes working here, The motto was simple: serve the wine, sell the charm, and dodge the gropes. A typical shift involved pouring watered-down wine into dirty cups for people who wouldn't notice the difference anyway. With your other hand, you flirted just enough to keep the denarii flowing, but not so much that a brawl broke out, unless that brawl was entertaining, in which case, carry on. Unlike the brothel, taverns were technically food establishments, so you had the delightful backdrop of boiled cabbage, fish sauce, and body odor. It was an aroma that clung to your tunic and your soul, but it also meant you could upsell a client. For 2 more coins, I'll pretend you don't smell of garum. In reality, a lot of them were smart, adaptable, and, dare we say it, better at business than half the Senate. They knew how to read a client, negotiate terms, avoid danger, and hustle a living in a city that cheered gladiators and stoned anyone who wore the wrong shoes. And they weren't all the same. Some were enslaved, some were free. Some catered to the wealthy, others to anyone who had 2 coins and bad breath. Some hated every second of it, others carved out small corners of power and routine. Most of them existed somewhere in between, just like everyone else in Rome, pretending they weren't exhausted. Their stories were rarely written by them. Instead, they were remembered by poets looking for metaphors, by moralists clutching their pearls, or by archaeologists piecing together Pompeii's dirtiest wall scribbles. But here's what's remarkable. They're still visible in stone carvings, in sarcastic graffiti, in laws and loopholes, and in offhand mentions in love poems. These women were erased from respectability, but not from reality. They worked, they laughed, they scammed, they wept, and they endured. All without marble statues or gilded tombs, just faint ink on a crumbling wall. Maritima was here, and she was worth every coin. So, the next time someone starts waxing poetic about the glory of Rome, remember that behind every toga-clad philosopher was a working girl keeping the economy and the gossip alive. In the world of the Vikings, warfare was a constant presence, and with it came injuries, deep cuts from swords, axe wounds, broken bones, and burns from fire and frost, whether on the battlefield or back in the village. That's when the Lakener, the healer, was called upon to treat the wounded. These people were respected members of society, blending the practical knowledge of herbs with the spiritual traditions of Norse belief. One of the most trusted herbs in a Viking healer's collection was yarrow, or Achillea millefolium. Viking healers used crushed garlic in poultices to clean wounds and prevent festering, particularly important for injuries sustained during battle or travel. When applied directly to cuts, garlic could kill harmful microbes and reduce inflammation. Though painful, this treatment was effective in preventing deeper infections in a time when even minor wounds could turn deadly. Internally, garlic was often eaten raw, pounded into pastes, or brewed into strong infusions. It was believed to strengthen the immune system, purify the blood, and warm the body during illness. In harsh northern winters, when colds, fevers, and coughs were widespread, garlic served as a valuable tonic. It was sometimes combined with honey, another antimicrobial agent, to make the strong flavor more palatable and to enhance its healing effect. Garlic was also used to treat parasites, especially intestinal worms, which were common due to poor sanitation and frequent contact with livestock. A mixture of garlic and vinegar was administered in small doses to purge the body. Its pungent nature made it a strong cleansing agent, and its association with vitality gave it symbolic weight in Norse healing traditions. Beyond the body, garlic was believed to repel evil spirits, and malevolent forces were a real concern in Viking society. To combat these unseen dangers, healers and even regular household members would often hang braided garlic near doorways or in sleeping areas. This wasn't just about warding off disease. It was a protective measure against spiritual threats, especially during vulnerable times like illness, war, or childbirth. For Viking warriors, garlic served as both a practical remedy and a spiritual safeguard. It wasn't merely a cure, it was a form of everyday defense. Before embarking on raids or long journeys, some Vikings are believed to have consumed garlic as part of their preparation. They saw its strength and fiery nature as creating a shield within the body. Her remarkable courage on the battlefield inspired others to fight with renewed determination and fervor. Over the course of a week, the French forces launched a series of daring offensives to break the English siege. Joan wielded not only her sword, but also her sacred banner, rallying the troops with fervent cries of faith and purpose. She was wounded during an assault on the fortress of Les Tourelles, struck in the shoulder by an arrow. However, refusing to retreat or be deterred, she returned to the field of battle after having the wound dressed, continuing to urge the men forward with unwavering resolve. On May 8th, the English forces finally lifted the siege and withdrew from Orleans. It was a stunning and unexpected victory, one that dramatically changed the momentum of the entire war. For the first time in years, the French had dealt a decisive blow to the seemingly invincible English forces. Joan's pivotal role in the victory was undeniable. Her inspiring leadership, her fearless courage, and her profound spiritual authority had demonstrably turned the tide of the battle. The victory at Orleans was far more than just a military achievement. It was a crucial turning point in the national consciousness of France. The seemingly ordinary peasant girl from Domremy had successfully fulfilled the first part of her divinely ordained mission. Now, she turned her unwavering focus toward her second and equally important goal: to see the Dauphin crowned as the rightful king of France at Reims, the traditional site of French royal coronations. The long and arduous road to legitimacy had finally begun. With the siege of Orleans lifted, Joan of Arc's mission shifted towards an even more symbolic and politically charged objective: the coronation of Charles the Dauphin. In her divinely inspired visions, this was not simply a political event or a traditional ceremony. It was a direct command from God. Joan didn't tell anyone at first. She kept the visions a secret, fearing disbelief or punishment. But the voices persisted, urging her to take action. Over the next few years, she became increasingly convinced that her mission was real. She began to devote herself even more deeply to prayer, fasting, and religious discipline, believing that her purity and obedience were essential for fulfilling God's will. By 1428, the political and military situation in France had only worsened. The English had captured much of northern France, and the city of Orleans, a key stronghold, was under siege. The Dauphin remained uncrowned, his legitimacy in question. Joan, now 16, believed that the time had come to act. She traveled to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs and requested a meeting with the local commander, Robert de Baudricourt, claiming that she had a message for the king. Initially, Baudricourt and his men dismissed her. They didn't take the teenage girl claiming divine guidance seriously. But Joan was persistent. She returned repeatedly, speaking with a conviction that made some uneasy and impressed others. Eventually, after hearing reports of her reputation for piety and learning that she had accurately predicted a military setback in Orleans before news of it had reached the town, Baudricourt relented. He agreed to send her, dressed in men's clothing and under armed escort, to meet the Dauphin. Joan's journey from a peasant child to a military envoy had begun, guided by visions, faith, and an unwavering sense of destiny. In early 1429, Joan of Arc arrived in Chinon, where Charles, the uncrowned Dauphin of France, held his court. The journey had been long and fraught with danger. She traveled over 300 miles through enemy territory, disguised as a man to avoid unwanted attention and assault. When she finally stood before the royal court, she was met with skepticism and curiosity. Charles, unsure of her motives and wary of trickery, decided to test her. In 1456, 25 years after her death, a formal investigation ordered by Pope Calixtus III declared Joan's trial invalid. She was officially exonerated, her name cleared of all accusations of heresy. In the centuries that ensued, Joan of Arc became a unifying symbol for France. During times of national crisis, particularly during the French Wars of Religion and later during the Franco-Prussian War, her story was invoked as a beacon of courage, patriotism, and divine purpose. Artists, writers, and historians immortalized her life through various mediums. Her image appeared in stained glass windows, sculptures, and countless literary works. She was celebrated as both a fierce warrior and a mystical figure, a simple peasant girl and a national heroine. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her execution, the Catholic Church formally canonized Joan of Arc as a saint. The very girl who had been condemned by church officials was now one of its most revered figures. Her feast day is celebrated on May 30th, the anniversary of her martyrdom. Today, Joan of Arc remains one of the most iconic figures in world history. Her life defied all expectations. Peasant, prophet, warrior, prisoner, saint. Through unwavering faith and profound conviction, she altered the course of a kingdom. Through the flames of martyrdom, she entered into legend. And through collective memory, she continues to live on. The daily existence of a medieval baker commenced in darkness, well before the first roosters crowed or the church bells announced the dawn. Bakers were already hard at work. Their day often began around midnight, when the rest of the town was sound asleep. The quiet streets were cold and still, but inside the bakehouse, flames crackled merrily, flour dust hung in the air, and the rhythmic kneading of dough began. Medieval bread making wasn't a spontaneous affair. It demanded precise timing and a highly skilled hand. In monasteries, cathedrals, and even humble village chapels, bread served as a potent symbol of life, sacrifice, and divine presence. At the heart of this connection was the Eucharist, the Christian rite in which bread becomes the body of Christ. The preparation of this bread, often called the host, was subject to incredibly strict guidelines. Only the finest white wheat flour could be used, and it had to be unleavened. Within monasteries, specific monks were assigned to this holy duty, baking in complete silence, often during the night in specially designated ovens. These wafers were stamped with sacred symbols and handled with extreme reverence. But the church's relationship with bread extended far beyond ritual. Monasteries were among the largest landowners and food producers in medieval Europe. Many operated their own bakehouses, producing vast quantities of bread for the monks, their workers, and guests. The daily monastic diet typically included multiple servings of bread, often paired with cheese, ale, or pottage. For the poor, monasteries also served as crucial lifelines, distributing alms bread to beggars and travelers who waited patiently at the gates. Cathedrals and parish churches frequently received bread donations from local bakers and wealthy patrons. These offerings might be displayed on feast days, distributed to the needy, or used in ceremonial processions. Some towns even had special bread altars where loaves were blessed and handed out in memory of the deceased. The church also played a regulatory role. In some towns, ecclesiastical courts handled disputes between bakers and customers, especially in areas where the local clergy governed commercial life. They helped enforce fair prices and weights, often motivated by the belief that cheating customers out of their bread was not just dishonest but inherently sinful. On religious feast days, special breads were baked, rich spiced loaves shaped into crosses, doves, or other sacred forms. Some women worked the back rooms or upstairs areas, making the tavern a part-time brothel with table service. Others kept things more casual, offering company, lap-sitting, and heavily suggestive compliments like, "Your toga looks clean." This was high praise in Rome. Payment was often immediate. Credit did not exist. If a client tried to delay, you had options. Yell, threaten, or grab the bouncer, who was usually a retired gladiator with one eye and a short temper. The upside? Taverns offered more foot traffic and sometimes better tips. The downside? You were a waitress, therapist, and hostage negotiator all at once, and no one tipped for emotional labor. And, of course, there was the endless soundtrack. Shouting, dice clacking, liar players trying to impress women, and the occasional argument over who invented democracy. Working tavern duty was unpredictable, exhausting, and smelled like despair, but it paid the bills. Sometimes, if the customers didn't vomit on your sandal first. For the entrepreneurial spirit with no brothel affiliation and maybe too much confidence, there was always the street. Freelance prostitution in Rome meant walking a fine line between independent contractor and, "Please don't arrest me." The Roman streets were alive with both opportunity and sewage. Prostitutes who worked outdoors were called prostituti, and they roamed the alleys, bathhouse entrances, marketplaces, and occasionally temple steps, because nothing says divine intervention quite like offering a discount outside a shrine to Venus. Daylight hours were decent for traffic, but risky. You had to navigate gawking citizens, nosy magistrates, and angry matrons who thought your existence was ruining their husband's self-control. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. You dressed brightly to stand out. Think short tunics, flashy jewelry, maybe a wig made from imported German hair. It was less understated elegance, more visible from across the Circus Maximus. Known for its ability to stop bleeding, yarrow was used widely across northern Europe. Viking healers would crush the leaves and apply them directly to wounds, either on their own or mixed into a poultice. Yarrow acted as a coagulant, helping to stop blood flow and prevent infection. It was even believed to have sacred properties, with legends connecting its power to Odin himself. Preparing these remedies was methodical and rooted in cultural ritual. The healer might wash the wound with boiled water infused with antiseptic herbs, apply crushed yarrow, and then bind the area tightly with linen or strips of animal skin. In some cases, chants or prayers were recited during the process, asking for protection or healing from the gods. Healing wasn't just physical, it was spiritual too. Beyond battlefield wounds, yarrow was also used internally. A tea made from its flowers and leaves could reduce fevers, ease digestive problems, or help relieve menstrual cramps. It was a versatile plant, and one that could be found growing throughout the Viking homelands, in fields, near rivers, or in small garden plots maintained by the women of the household. In this way, garlic became a symbol of endurance, fighting off infections, energizing the weak, and providing a sense of stability in a dangerous and constantly changing world. In the Viking Age, the stinging nettle, known scientifically as Urtica dioica, was more than just an irritating plant. It was considered a plant of power. Despite its painful sting, the nettle was one of the most useful and highly regarded herbs in Norse healing traditions. It grew abundantly in meadows, along the edges of forests, and near settlements, making it easily accessible to both healers and ordinary households. Its medicinal benefits were numerous, and its resilience in harsh conditions mirrored the strength and endurance that the Vikings valued so highly. Nettle was primarily used to treat conditions related to blood and vitality. Viking healers would prepare nettle teas or broths to combat fatigue, iron deficiency, and general weakness. Rich in essential nutrients like iron, calcium, and vitamin C, nettle acted as a natural tonic, which was especially important during the long winter months when fresh food was scarce and illness spread easily. Warriors recovering from battle wounds or children recovering from fevers were often given nettle to help them rebuild their strength. The leaves of the nettle plant were typically dried or cooked to reduce their stinging properties before being brewed into infusions. These drinks were believed to purify the blood, improve circulation, and encourage the body to eliminate harmful substances. Nettle also had a mild diuretic effect, making it useful for treating fluid retention and joint pain, which were common ailments among laborers and older members of the community. In external treatments, nettle was sometimes used in surprising ways. The practice of urtication, which involved striking sore limbs with fresh nettle stalks, was used to stimulate circulation and relieve symptoms of arthritis or muscle stiffness. Charles needed to be crowned at Reims, the historic site where French kings had traditionally been anointed with sacred oil for centuries. However, Reims was located deep within territory controlled by the Burgundians, who were allies of the English. To reach the city, Joan and the French army would have to march through hostile and heavily defended lands. Despite the significant risks involved, Joan remained steadfast in her conviction. Her unwavering belief that God had cleared the path before them gave her unshakable confidence, and her conviction began to influence even the cautious and politically astute Charles. After securing several important victories along the Loire Valley, including battles at Jargeau, Mung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency, momentum was clearly on the French side. The army grew stronger as more towns and villages submitted to French rule, and morale among the troops and the populace surged. By July of 1429, Joan and the royal court set out on what would later be referred to as the coronation journey. Along the way, cities and castles opened their gates without resistance. Word of Joan's miraculous successes had spread far and wide. Many believed that to resist her was to actively resist divine will itself. Her very presence in the army, young, determined, and riding beneath her iconic white banner, created an aura of invincibility. On July 16th, the French forces reached the city of Reims. The city's leaders, after some initial hesitation and debate, surrendered peacefully to the French army. The next day, inside the magnificent cathedral of Reims, Charles was formally crowned King Charles VII of France. Joan stood proudly beside him, holding her banner high. For her, it was the ultimate fulfillment of the prophecy she had received from her divine voices. The coronation was a moment of unparalleled triumph, both for the newly crowned king and for Joan herself. He disguised himself in ordinary clothes and hid among his courtiers. Joan, who had never seen him before, immediately identified him and addressed him directly. Witnesses were astonished. She reportedly told him details that only he and his closest advisors would have known, possibly concerning a private prayer or a secret doubt. For many in the court, this was the first indication that something beyond explanation was at play. Still, Charles remained cautious. He ordered that Joan be examined by theologians and church officials in Poitiers. For several weeks, she was questioned about her visions, her moral character, and her religious beliefs. She was a teenage girl being scrutinized by learned men, yet she answered with composure and confidence. Her virginity was also tested, as it was believed that her purity was essential for her divine mission. The examiners found nothing heretical in her claims and noted her remarkable character and intelligence, despite her lack of formal education. The court's advisors concluded that she could be sent to Orleans with the army. But first, Joan requested something symbolic, something that would signal her role not merely as a soldier, but as a divine emissary. She asked for a banner. The banner she received was white, embroidered with an image of Christ and the words, Jesus Maria. It would become her most prized possession, and she carried it into every battle, declaring that she preferred the banner to the sword. She was also fitted with a custom-made suit of white armor and given a sword that she claimed to have been divinely led to discover behind the altar of a chapel in St. Catherine de Fierbois. With her armor, banner, and a company of soldiers, Joan prepared to march toward Orleans. She was just 17 years old, young, untrained, and utterly convinced that God had sent her to save France. Her arrival at the besieged city would mark the beginning of one of the most legendary military campaigns in European history. Bakers relied on sourdough starters, carefully maintained and nurtured fermenting doughs that provided rise and distinct flavor to the loaves. There were no commercially produced yeasts available. Everything was done by feel, by scent, and through accumulated experience. The flour used was often coarse, ground at a local mill, and possessed its own unique characteristics based on the region, the season, and the quality of the grain. Some bakers even incorporated bran, barley, or beans into their dough to stretch their limited flour supplies. Water was drawn from wells or public fountains. Everything had to be measured and mixed entirely by hand, often in the dim light cast by oil lamps or flickering candles. The mixing trough was typically made of wood, and the dough had to be kneaded until it reached the desired texture, a task that required considerable strength and tireless repetition. During the colder months, the dough had to be kept warm with cloths or positioned near the hearth to ensure proper rising. The oven, usually a large, dome-shaped brick structure, had to be heated well in advance of baking. Bakers would burn bundles of wood inside until the walls radiated sufficient heat to bake several batches of bread. The ashes were carefully raked out, and the oven floor was cleaned with a damp cloth or a wooden peel before the loaves were carefully slid inside. By the time the town began to stir, with merchants setting up their stalls and church doors opening for morning mass, the baker's first loaves were already emerging from the oven. The comforting aroma of warm bread filled the air, a scent of sustenance and daily survival. For many in the medieval world, bread was the foundation of every meal. But for the baker, it was merely the beginning. Deliveries had to be made, customers had to be served, and meticulous records had to be kept. These celebratory breads marked the rhythm of the liturgical year and were often shared within the community to strengthen bonds of faith and fellowship. In the medieval imagination, bread was not only physical sustenance. It was also spiritual nourishment. For the baker, supplying bread to the church meant more than simply earning a living. It meant actively participating in the sacred economy of life, where dough became divine and the oven echoed with ritual as much as with routine. In the medieval world, bread was inextricably linked to power. For rulers, mayors, guild masters, and kings, controlling the price, supply, and quality of bread was just as important as maintaining law and order. Because bread was the staple food for the vast majority of the population, often comprising 70% or more of an individual's daily diet, its availability was directly linked to political stability. The most visible manifestation of this power dynamic played out through price controls. Cities and kingdoms established official rates for bread through laws such as the assize of bread and ale in England, which tied the price of a loaf to the current cost of grain. If grain prices rose due to poor harvests, drought, or war, bakers were expected to adjust the size of their loaves, not the price. This meant that during times of scarcity, bakers had to produce smaller loaves for the same price, often significantly cutting into their own profits. However, if a baker was caught shortchanging customers or selling loaves that were below the legally mandated weight, the punishment could be severe. Authorities viewed cheating as not just theft but as a profound betrayal of the public trust. In some towns, bakers were pilloried, forced to stand in public stocks while holding underweight loaves for all to see. Others were fined, publicly shamed, or even banned from baking altogether. The goal was to catch a client's eye before his wife caught him. Approaching a potential customer involved a delicate dance of flirtation, timing, and not getting mistaken for someone's runaway slave. You'd smile, compliment his sandals, and casually mention your rate before the local vigiles, street guards, decided your entrepreneurialism was public disorder. Some clients were polite, others were aggressively cheap, and a few were very confused and just wanted directions to the bathhouse. You learned quickly to tell them apart, mostly by the level of eye contact and how many coins they were jingling. Competition was fierce. You weren't just up against fellow prostituti. You were up against free lovers, drunken party girls, and retired gladiators with a side hustle. Everyone was trying to make a denarius. There were no benefits, no security, just your charm, your wits, and the ability to walk very fast in sandals. Some carried small knives or relied on nearby tavern bouncers. Others simply prayed that tonight's customers weren't philosophers with commitment issues. Still, for all its chaos, the street scene had its advantages. You set your own hours, kept your own profits, and didn't have to answer to a Leno breathing down your neck. Sure, the job came with the occasional drunk goat or philosophical heckler, but at least you were your own boss. In a city where bosses were rarely the good guys. If you thought the life of a Roman prostitute was already tough, allow us to introduce your least favorite client, the Roman tax collector. Yes, the Roman Empire, brilliant engineers, conquerors of the Mediterranean, champions of the toga, also invented a dedicated tax on prostitutes. It was called the vectigal ex capturis, and it ensured that even your most awkward encounters contributed to Rome's public infrastructure. Congratulations! Your nightly services just funded another aqueduct. The tax wasn't just unofficial pocket skimming either. Although painful, this practice was believed to bring warmth and renewed vitality back to cold or stiff areas of the body. This method, while unusual by modern standards, was based on generations of observation and a deep-seated belief in the plant's invigorating properties. From her obscure origins in a small village, she had risen to command armies and to personally place the crown upon a monarch's head. The people of France saw her not just as a military heroine, but as a chosen messenger of God. Her remarkable presence had transformed the war from a mere political struggle into a deeply spiritual cause. However, this hard-won success also brought with it a sense of underlying tension and uncertainty. With Charles now officially crowned, some members of the court began to question Joan's continued influence. Politics began to reassert themselves, and old rivalries resurfaced. Joan had successfully completed the specific task she had been divinely called to perform, but she was far from finished. Her next burning desire was to press forward and reclaim the city of Paris, which was still under English occupation. Yet, The unwavering support she had once so easily commanded was beginning to wane. After the momentous coronation at Reims, Joan of Arc relentlessly pushed for a bold new objective, the liberation of Paris, which remained firmly under the control of English and Burgundian forces. For Joan, reclaiming the French capital was not merely a matter of political necessity or strategic advantage. It was an integral part of her divinely ordained mission to fully restore France to its rightful king. However, not everyone shared her sense of urgency or her unwavering conviction. King Charles VII, newly crowned and increasingly cautious in his political dealings, hesitated to commit to such a risky undertaking. His advisors urged diplomacy, favoring a negotiated truce with the Burgundians. But Joan remained resolute in her belief. She argued that any delay would only serve to strengthen the enemy's position and that God had already cleared the path for a decisive victory. Eventually, Charles reluctantly agreed to an assault on Paris, although without his full and enthusiastic commitment. And once the ovens cooled and the counters were cleared, there was little time for rest, as tomorrow's dough would need to be mixed before the moon set once again. In medieval towns, the baker's work was never truly complete. Bakers were also required to maintain detailed records of grain purchases, flour usage, and the number of loaves baked each day. Inspectors could show up unannounced to weigh loaves and examine ovens to ensure compliance. During particularly tense times, such as during war or famine, bakers were sometimes placed under military guard to ensure fair distribution and prevent hoarding. Bread riots were among the most feared expressions of social unrest. When bread became scarce or unaffordable, angry mobs could form quickly. In such cases, bakers might be accused of hoarding flour or favoring the wealthy at the expense of the poor. Entire shops could be looted, and crucial records destroyed in the ensuing chaos. To maintain peace and prevent further escalation, city officials would sometimes seize grain stocks or subsidize bread prices to avert widespread starvation and quell potential protests. Because of its central importance to daily life, bread became a powerful tool of both charity and control. Rulers distributed bread during public celebrations or religious festivals to curry favor with the people. In castles, lords ensured that their retainers and servants had ample supplies of bread, reinforcing loyalty and solidifying their position of power. And in towns, a steady supply of affordable bread was seen as the unmistakable mark of good governance. In medieval politics, bread wasn't just food. It was a potent symbol of power, and the baker stood at the critical intersection of hunger and authority, playing a delicate and often precarious role. Though rarely named in chronicles or praised in songs, the medieval baker left behind a profound legacy that shaped the very foundation of everyday life. In a world dominated by castles and cathedrals, kings and knights, it was the humble baker who fed the people, sustaining entire communities. This was a state-sanctioned system managed by professional collectors known as publicani, men who were somehow both boring and terrifying. They kept detailed records, demanded payment in cash, and probably judged your perfume choices while scribbling on their wax tablets. To legally operate, prostitutes had to register with the aediles, the Roman equivalent of a city inspector with an affinity for paperwork and moral superiority. He provided only a limited number of troops and deliberately delayed the start of the campaign, effectively weakening the entire effort before it had even begun. And while their tireless work was often done in darkness, before the town ever woke, its impact touched every household, nourishing bodies and spirits alike. The baker's influence extended far beyond the ovens and into the cultural fabric of medieval society. From birth to death, bread accompanied every stage of life, marking important transitions and providing comfort. It was present at baptisms, shared during weddings, offered in times of mourning, and honored at church altars as a symbol of faith. Every loaf baked carried with it centuries of tradition, belief, and the enduring will to survive. The essential skills of the baker were passed down through generations, often within families or through structured apprenticeships. Techniques were taught by hand and through tireless repetition, learning how to feel when dough was ready, how to accurately read the oven's heat without relying on a thermometer, and how to stretch limited flour supplies during lean times without sacrificing quality. These traditions were deeply rooted in place and community, reflecting local resources and customs. A baker in one region might favor rye and oats, while another relied primarily on barley or imported wheat. Every town developed its own distinct flavor profile. Over time, as cities grew and trade networks expanded, the role of the baker gradually evolved. By the late Middle Ages, commercial bakeries became increasingly common, and baking began to shift from a small household craft to a full-fledged industry. Innovations like windmills and watermills significantly improved flour production, and better road systems facilitated the efficient movement of grain from farms to bustling markets. Despite this progress and the advent of new technologies, the essential rhythm of baking remained remarkably unchanged. Rise, knead, shape, fire, feed. It was a cycle as old as civilization itself, and the medieval baker stood as its quiet and dedicated custodian. Even today, echoes of their enduring work survive in our modern world. In languages around the world, the word for companion derives from the Latin companes, meaning with bread, a poignant reminder that sharing bread meant sharing life. The guilds that once regulated bakers paved the way for modern food safety standards, ensuring the quality and safety of our food supply. And the communal ovens of medieval villages laid the foundation for today's neighborhood bakeries, where the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread continues to draw people together. In the end, the medieval baker's legacy is not just in the loaves they made, but in the sustained life of the community they nourished. Through flour, fire, and unwavering faith, they fed more than just bodies. They nourished entire societies, leaving an indelible mark on history.